Welcome, friends of the Greasy Shop Rag. The other day I got an email that read something like this. Dude, I just picked up a Craftsman 18-inch 42cc saw alongside of the road. Totally stoked about it. Wondering if you have any tips on how I should get started on the repair. My best bud's a cable TV installer and he's got a totally awesome set of tools, man. Later. Alright, I can relate. I used to find push mowers alongside the road that people were throwing out, and a lot of times it was a sheared flywheel key. You know, a 59-cent part, and you got a push mower that you can resell for beer money or whatever it is. So, on your chainsaw, is it worth fixing? The first thing you want to do is find out what a new one is worth. A 42cc Craftsman 18-inch chainsaw at Lowe's is $180. Most people would say that you never want to put more than half the value of the saw into a repair. And that's the max. But you have to ask yourself a question: why do you want to fix it? Do you need the saw to cut down a tree? Do you want to educate yourself on fixing chainsaws? Or are you going to try and flip it? So, the easiest one, you need a chainsaw. I would draw the line at $90 worth of repair work. If you get a functioning saw for half price, nothing wrong with that. If you want to educate yourself, you're going to have to, I guess the sky's the limit, whatever you think an education is worth. If you want to flip it, the saw needs to be pretty. And if it ran, that would be good too. But if you put a picture of a dirty ass chainsaw on Facebook Marketplace, you're not going to get any hits. Doesn't matter what the dollar amount is. The only hits you might get are from other guys that think they could buy it and flip it, and they'll give you nothing for it. So if the idea is to flip it, it has to be pretty. That dirty saw on Facebook is that's what all the viewers are going to think when they see that picture. So let's get into it. If the saw is pretty and you want to flip it, now you got to decide how much money you're going to stick into it. The first and easiest thing to look at is the bar and chain. If the chain still has teeth left on it, it's not down to the wear marks, and you go through and physically inspect it and there are no broken or cracked links, and the drivers all looked intact and they're not gone, missing, or broken, you might be okay with the chain. You want to look at the bar and determine if, I forgot to add, the chain should be oily. If it's dry, you're going to have to look at whether or not the oiler is actually working. The bar, you want to look at the nose, make sure that it's not splitting open and the chain is recessing into it. You want to make sure the chain don't flop around in a big sloppy groove in the bar. And you can also look at the history. This one, the paint is missing down here and there's some bluing. So at one point, this bar has been flipped, but at one point it ran dry or it ran hot. After you look at the bar and chain, you can flip it over, take a look at the clutch drum, make sure that it doesn't need replacing. That might be a $20 part. That drum should be, the sprocket teeth, should not have these grooves in it like this one has. That should be a smooth tooth going all the way across. So this one's junk. So let's say everything is pretty on the bar and chain. And that wouldn't be surprising on a saw you find alongside the curb, because odds are it's sitting there because it didn't start. So you can open up the gas cap, And grab your handy dandy light. Take a look inside. Now as you're bending over looking in here, you're going to be able to smell whether or not this is fresh fuel or if it's 2-year-old swamp gas. What I'm looking for is a pliable fuel line with a filter attached to it. Then I'm looking at the quality of the fuel. Does it look like there's oil in the fuel? And more importantly, when I look at the bottom of the tank and I tip the tank, does any water run to the bottom? Is there a puddle? Well, the water is going to sit in the bottom of the fuel. So is there a puddle of water in there? And this one looks good. All right, now we determined that we got a good bar and chain and sprocket. Tank is full of clean fuel, and the fuel line isn't broken. Let's take a look at the rest of the exterior. You know, these anti-vibe springs are all intact. You know, if you had to replace a spring, that wouldn't be a big deal. But if the spring where it attaches to the tank is stripped out, you know, that might need epoxy or replacement of a tank. The epoxy, that's cheap. The replacement of the tank might be a deal breaker. Remember, we don't want to exceed $90 on this $180 saw if we're building it for ourselves. If you're going to flip it, you don't want to stick any money into it because you're not going to make jack on it anyway. If we take the cover off, it looks like this was a well-maintained saw. It's not full of sawdust. The filter is still serviceable. Throttle mechanism works. Choke linkage and fast idle seem to work. Our decompression button isn't stuck or gummy. That's a good sign. We're going to take a look inside the cylinder. I'm in the habit of looking at the spark plug when I pull it out to see if there's any metal transfer on it. I like to guess what the cylinder might look like based on what I see on the plug. This is the game I like playing. So we're going to get the piston down to the bottom of the stroke, and we're going to look at the cylinder wall. The worst spot is usually going to be above the exhaust port if it's bad, but what we should be looking at is clean and shiny. So here's a cylinder off a different saw. Carburetor side, muffler side. If you can't physically look through the spark plug hole at the cylinder wall above the exhaust port, you may have to take the muffler off so you can look right in at the piston. You know, some of these are 10mm spark plugs and you just can't really get in there very good. So what you're going to be looking for is scoring. On this one, this is the exhaust side of the piston. This is the intake side. So you can see how nice and smooth this is. There's still machining marks in here. On this side, it's physically scratched, or what we call scored, from here all the way across to here. This saw ran. These rings are not set in the grooves. They move around. So the saw would start and it would run. After it got hot, it would lose power because this piston's going to expand. It's going to pinch these rings in here, and then you're going to lose compression and power. Now, the occasional user might start it up, make a few cuts, shut it off, and put it away. And they think, well, the saw is great. But in fact, if they tried to restart it, they might not get it started because the rings are set in the grooves and you have no compression. So no matter if it runs or not during a test run, you want to look in the cylinder and make sure it's clean in there. I would say that you might be able to buy a piston and cylinder on a cheap saw like that Craftsman for a reasonable amount of money. And I guess I would only do that if the reason for this was education. Because, you know, replacing the piston and cylinder, you'd learn a lot about the saw if everything else was good. But you do have to remember that if it's scored, there's got to be a reason for it being scored. This is what we call a lean seize, when it is scored across the exhaust port. It ran lean, not oil and fuel mixed lean, but fuel and air lean. There was an air leak somewhere in the system where the carb is metering the fuel, but then beyond the carb it's sucking air somewhere. It could be the decomp valve, it could be the cylinder base gasket, it could be the crank seals. If you find a saw like this and you just replace the piston and cylinder and fire it back up and start using it, you're probably going to end up with the same problem. You need to determine if the carb was adjusted too lean or if you had an air leak somewhere. And getting into pressure testing for an air leak is a whole nother deal we can get into on a different video. But you have to keep in mind that you're only fixing the result of the problem, not the problem itself when you swap this out. So one important point that I need to make is that if you're evaluating this saw for repair and you find that it needs a bar and a chain, or maybe it needs a sprocket, or maybe the fuel system's all jacked up and you think it needs a carburetor, don't go jumping on Amazon and buying a carburetor until you follow through and look in the cylinder, determine that everything's good in there. Failure to do so, failure to do so is bullshit, because it's gonna bite you in the ass. So if you take nothing else from this video, take the fact that you need to follow through inspecting everything before you make any determination whether or not you're going to be buying parts for it. So that's all I got for you. Thanks for watching. Later.